In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to make our enemies move. But first, last lesson I forgot to download my TIC-80 file, so I'm going to go ahead and do a get lesson13.tic, and that should download automatically to your downloads folder. And then I'm going to go ahead and load up that lesson 13 and change the header to lesson 14, enemy movement. And I'm going to hit escape and save lesson 14. The first thing I want to do to start setting up my movement is go to my add enemy function. I'm going to go ahead and shrink this font here, and we're going to add an input into this function that's going to be the type of motion that we want to use for that enemy. So my motion. And then in the table for the enemy, we're going to add comma and then motion equals my motion. This is just going to be a text descriptor of the motion that we want. That's all we have to do for the add enemy function. Nothing else is going to change. But when we call the add enemy function, now we need to give this descriptor here. So I'm going to go to initialize. And for each of these functions, I need to give a descriptor of what the motion is going to be like. So I'm going to use none for no movement. And I'm going to use march for just moving back and forth, back and forth. We'll also have a drop and an AI eventually. So right now, if I run my code, I'm going to go ahead and save, Control S, and then Control R. So right now nothing's happening because I haven't actually implemented the move code, but nothing is broken. Next, let's go to the bottom of our code, which was hit enemy. Was the last function that we made. And let's make another function. I'm going to call it move march. So each of these movement functions is going to start with the word move, just so it's a little bit easier to find them. So move march. And this function is going to take an input of a sprite. Could be an object, it could be an enemy. You can use these movement functions on any of your sprites. Let's end the function. I'm going to start out with a local variable called count. And I'm going to use my time variable. So it's going to be t mod 500. And then I'm going to integer divide that by 10. And if I kind of do this math right here, 500 divided by 10, that would be a value of 50. And that's going to come into play in our next bit of code. So then I'm going to do an if-else. This is going to be left-right movement. I'm going to divide the count in half, so 25. And if my count is less than 25, I want to move to the right. So this will be sprite.x equals sprite.spawnx plus count. So what this does for us is it allows us to use our spawn x as both our start and end point. And so we're going to have the sprite march back and forth, always ending up back at spawn x. This count comes from here. So we're adding 0, adding 1, adding 2, adding 3, all the way up to 50. But because we're keeping count less than 25, we're only using half of the count so far. If that didn't make sense, that's okay. This is hard stuff to understand. And I've been doing it for quite a few years now, and I still have to play around with it for it to make sense in my head. So this is going to be going to the right. And when we're going to the right, I want to make sure that I have my right-hand sprite costume. In my sprite editor, my left-hand costume is first, and then my right-hand costume is always 2 spaces after that. So what I'm going to do here is return 2, and then when I actually draw my sprite in the draw function, wherever that might be for my particular sprite, I can add this number to the costume, and then that'll make it be my right-hand costume. Otherwise, so if once the count hits 25, this time I'm going to do 25, 24, 23, 22, count down. And to do that, we do sprite.x equals sprite.spawnx plus 50 minus count. And if you take a minute and do that math, you'll see that that does end up being 25, 24, 23. We're taking our original value, let's just say we started at 0. We're adding 50 to that, and then that 50 value, we're always subtracting count, which is going to be subtract 26, subtract 27, subtract 28, and that'll let us go to the left. And then for this one, I'm going to return 0 since my original sprite costume, my first sprite costume, is what I use as my sprite number when I'm making my character. So I don't have to add anything to that to get the right costume. All right, let's save this. And then we're going to do a little bit more code before this is going to work because we haven't actually called our move march function at all yet. So what we're going to do is go into our draw enemies function. So right now we're drawing the enemy if it's active, and if it's not active, then we're drawing the inactive enemy costume. So we're going to make this code a little bit more complicated. First, we're going to say that this sprite costume or this sprite drawing is going to be just if we're not moving. So we're going to do another if inside this if. This is where it can get kind of complicated. So remember, we have this outer structure of if else, and then if the enemy is active, we're going to put some more code in here for different options that can happen when the enemy is active. So if the enemy is active, if the E stands for our enemy, so E dot motion is equal to none, then we want to draw the sprite in its standing still costume. Otherwise, if E dot motion is equal to march, then we're going to do a couple things. We're going to set our costume. So C, as we called it up here, is going to be equal to C plus move march. So we're calling the function move march, and we're setting our costume based on its return value. So whatever move march returns to us, we're going to add that to C. So if we're moving to the right, it's going to return 2, so our costume will be adding 2. And if it's moving left, it's going to return 0, so our costume will just stay the same. Okay, but I'm not done yet because this move march function requires an input of the sprite that it's supposed to be looking at. So my sprite is E, so I'll give it an input of E. Next, we want to actually draw the sprite. And this sprite is going to have motion. So I want to do my animation. Up here, I'm doing a static, just first costume. But down here, when it's marching, I want to show that it actually has some movement. So I'm going to do my C costume plus T mod 60. You might remember this. Double divide 30. And this is the same up in the TIC function. So the same code here, I'm taking the costume and adding T mod 60 double divide 30, and that just adds either 1 or 0, 1 or 0, 1 or 0 every time. So when I'm looking at my sprite costume, I'm either adding 0 to stay the same costume or adding 1 to go to the next costume, and it'll just keep switching back and forth. Back to my draw enemies. So we have our costume. Next, we need our X and Y value. So we're going to draw that at E.X, E.Y. The last thing is the 0 to represent the background color of black. So remember in Move March, we affected the sprite's X value. So we are updating our X value when we call Move March based on what the count is. All right, let's Control S and let's go ahead and run it and see if we get any errors. Oh darn. All right, then expected near C. I'm guessing that's back in my draw enemies. Yep, okay, right back here. I forgot a then. Maybe you noticed that. I noticed that I also did not end the function, so let's go ahead and do that here. This is the end of the e.motion section, and then this if down here is the end of the e.active section. And in fact, I'm going to give myself a little bit more space here. So all of this code here is inside this if. All right, so let's go ahead and save and run again. All right, okay, and here we go. We have our little cow marching along. I may want to change his starting point, it looks like, now that I have my marching length. Or maybe I want to play around with those marching numbers and make his march a little bit longer. So next, let's add another enemy. So I'm going to go to my initialize function. I'm going to add another enemy. I'm going to use the same cow costume, but this time I'm going to do something more over on the right-hand side. So I'm going to start at 150, and I want to be up in the air, so I'm going to put it way up at 10. And then instead of march, I'm going to do a drop. So let's make a drop function way down here at the bottom. And again, we're going to need a sprite as our input. And inside this function, I'm going to basically sort of recreate gravity, but in a slightly less complicated way. So when we did gravity for Blobby, we gave him a velocity and made that velocity get bigger each time. So it would be like he's speeding up as he comes toward the ground. For this enemy, I'm going to keep it more simple and just add the same amount every time, so it'll be a constant fall. He's not going to speed up toward the ground. But if you wanted to do more of a gravity effect, you could recreate the code that we used for Blobby. So to make the sprite fall, we're going to take the sprite's y value, and we're going to add 1. So let's go ahead and add our move drop option to our draw enemies function. So I'm going to add another else if e.motion equals drop, double equals drop. Then I'm just going to call my move drop function. This time, move drop is not going to return anything because I don't need to worry about whether it's facing left or right. And I'm going to give it an input of my enemy. And then I want to draw this sprite. And in order to draw the sprite, I'm going to use my costume, just normal costume, e.x, e.y. The x will be staying the same and the y will be changing. 0 for my background color. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a couple more things here. I'm going to do a 1 for the scale, and then a 2 for the flip. So when I looked at the documentation, we can put in the ID, the X, Y, and the background color. We already knew all that. The scale comes next. And then there's this flip value, and it says flip the sprite vertically or horizontally or both. And it gives you a key down here for the flip. So 0 would be no flip, 1 would be flip sideways, 2 would be flip vertically, like upside down, and then 3 would be flip both upside down and sideways. So we could have used this for the left-right costumes. We could have changed the flip number from 0 to 1. So there's lots of different ways that you can code things. So I'm going to use a 2 in that last value, and that means that my cow is going to be upside down as it falls. I just thought that might be kind of fun. So let's go ahead and save and run, and there goes my cow. Now, my cow is still falling. He's still going down, 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 down. So what I want to do is add in some code that says once he hits the edge of the screen, I want him to deactivate and stop moving. So back in my drop function, so I want to add in an if statement here that says if my y value is greater than the bottom of the screen, which is, I believe, 136, and we can check that by going back to the home page and 136. There's a lot of places that it says it. So if it goes off the screen, then we want to make the sprite deactivate. And if it's not off the screen yet, then we want to let it keep falling. There we go. All right, I'm going to save and run. Oh, 390, attempt to compare number with nil. Move, drop. Oh, so I got an error. And I realized that I just used a plain y here. And I should have done sprite.y. Maybe you caught that. All right, let's save and run. There goes my cow. And it's hiding right there off the screen. I could prove that to myself by changing this to something like 120. And then it'll stop earlier. Now, because he's inactive, his sprite costume changes to the inactive costume, which is fine. It'll be off the screen wearing its inactive costume. Okay, so let's go ahead and add one more type of movement. I'm going to add, I guess I could have just copied and pasted this. I'm going to add an AI movement. I'm just going to call it AI. And I'm going to start this one in the upper left corner. So I'm just going to do 2020. And then let's go back to the drop. And I'll add another function. And I'll call it move AI with an input of a sprite. All right, this one I feel like is kind of fun because it will follow your movement around. So what we're going to do here is look at the X and Y separately, and we're going to try and move our enemy sprite toward our player sprite. So first I'm going to do an if statement, if blobby.x minus sprite.x is greater than 0. So what this is saying is if blobby is over here on the right and the sprite is over here on the left, and I subtract those two numbers, I'll get a positive value because the blobby number is bigger than the sprite value. So if that number is positive, I want my sprite to move toward blobby, going to the right. So I'm going to add a certain amount to my sprite X. And I'll start with 1, and then we'll kind of play with it from there. Else, then we know that it must be less than 0, this value, which means that my sprite is over on the right and my blobby is over on the left. So I want to move to the left. So I'll just do the same thing, but minus 1. And then I want to end this if. So this whole thing is just kind of seeing where blobby is, seeing where the sprite is, and making the sprite move toward blobby. And we'll do a very similar thing with the Y. So if the y value is positive when you subtract the 2, then we want to add 1. And otherwise, we want to subtract 1. So I already have my initialize with AI, but I have not changed my draw enemies. So let's add in another else if e.motion is equal to AI. Then I want to call my AI function. Right now I'm just going to call it. In a second I'll add in the costume because we're going to see that we want to switch costume. So I'm just going to call move AI with an input of my enemy. Save that. Oh, 228, attempt to call, add enemy. Oh, I misspelled enemy. So in my initialize function, maybe you noticed this, enemy, there we go. I need to add in the costume here, otherwise that's not going to draw. So let's go ahead and I'm going to make it the movement, the animated costume, and let's test that out. Control S to save, and there we go. So that guy's, see how he's following me, and he's really fast, and he's also kind of blurry. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my move AI. So if it's too fast, I want to lower this number. Let's try 0.5. So that's a little better. He's still a little blurry. He should never go off the screen. Oh, I got him. Because he's looking for blob. Oh. If he goes off the screen, let me see if I can get him to go off the screen. No. So it looks like I can't get him to go off the screen. But if he did, okay, well, I'm dead, but if he did go off the screen, he would just want to come back and get blobby again. So you'll notice that it's always looking the same way, but I want him to go ahead and not be moving backwards. So what I'm going to do is something similar to what we did in another method, where if we're moving right, then I want to return 2, and I'll use that in my costume. Otherwise, I'm going to return 0. And I don't care about this up-down part. I just care about the left-right part. So I don't need to worry about returning anything down here. All right, so back up in my draw enemies function. I'm going to actually save this value just like we did up here. So it's going to be C equals C plus the return value of move AI, which will be either 2 or 0. That'll make my costume move to the left or to the right. Why is it stuck up there? Oh, so because I'm returning something, I don't want to return before I'm able to check the Y value. So I'm going to go ahead and move the Y value before the X value so that the return can be the last thing that happens in this function. There we go. Still maybe a little fast. I think it's maybe okay. I might go down a little bit more in the speed, but I think it's pretty good for now. Okay, so if you look back at your initialize function, now you have ways to do different kinds of enemies. You might choose to start in level 1 having not moving enemies, and then in level 2 maybe they march, and in level 3 maybe they drop, and then level 4 maybe they're AI. Or you might choose to always have the same type of enemy but add projectiles to the enemy, or maybe your game only drops things from the sky, but they get faster. You could have pickups that move that don't hurt you, but are allowing you to, to get a faster speed or grow or something like that. All kinds of ways that you can use these. I'm going to make a video about allowing your enemy to throw projectiles, and that will also go over what we talked about long time ago when I talked about the slime and being able to have more than one projectile on the screen at a time. All right, so we'll see you then.